of death goes away. Record. That's not good. All right, give me one.
Okay.
I'm perfectly okay if we don't record it also. I mean, posterity doesn't need to know. We don't need to keep records of this. It's fine.
Oh, you'll do great, Alicia.
I've already joined. Hold on, one more. Well, it claims it's recording now, so I guess go ahead.
Okay, we'll get started. So, hi everyone, I'm Tracy Holloway, and I am introducing today's seminar speaker. I'm really thrilled to be introducing Alicia Hoffman, who is a PhD student in my group, and she is a second-year PhD student here at the AOS department. Alicia joined Wisconsin after a master's in atmospheric chemistry from the University of California, Irvine. And before that, she graduated from Beloit College, majoring in chemistry and anthropology. So Alicia is an NSF graduate research fellow, and she'd been doing more hands-on lab-based experimental work before she came here to Wisconsin. And so it's been fun to be working with her as she's learning about computer modeling and data analysis. And so the project she's presenting here is the work that she's been doing over the past year, where she's been getting up to speed on the wonderful world of models and statistics. And actually, for her next step, she'll be working on a project that was recently funded by the EPA, led by Tim Bertram in the chemistry department, where she'll be improving some of the chemical mechanisms used in the most advanced computer model from the EPA. So we're excited to hear your talk, Alicia, and thanks for taking the time to share it with all of us.
Thank you, Tracy. Let me share my screen here. So can everyone see the screen?
Looks good.
Okay, so as Tracy mentioned, I'll be talking about some modeling and statistical results. So looking at how weather conditions influence ozone concentration around Lake Michigan. And as Tracy also mentioned, this is sort of my first foray into modeling data. So I need to say a big thank you to Monica Harkey, who is our lab modeling guru. And she's answered so many questions about the data that I will be presenting on, but also she generated a lot of the computer modeling data. And then I also need to thank Yuping Tang, who is a previous group member. He laid the foundations for the work that I'll be showing today. And finally, I need to acknowledge that the material in this presentation is based upon work supported by the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program under grant number BGE 1747503. Okay, so today I'll be starting off with a brief outline of what is ozone, why do we care about it, and then I'll sort of head into how ozone and weather are related, which will lead me into my analysis of meteorology and ozone. And so I'll talk about my study approach and the statistical analysis I did, and then I'll present some results and next steps. So at this point, I want to clarify that when I'm talking about ozone for this presentation, I'll be talking about tropospheric ozone as opposed to stratospheric ozone. So stratospheric ozone, it's good, we like it. Tropospheric ozone down here, also called ambient ozone, and it is not as good. So just to sort of provide a little context, we have this image in the background here. This is photo I took on the Lake Express ferry, which travels between Muskegon, Michigan, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And if you squint, you might be able to see Milwaukee off in the distance there. And so this was a fun little trip across Lake Michigan for me. The sun was shining, temperatures were nice and warm, not a lot of wind, beautiful conditions. But these are also sort of ideal conditions for ozone formation. So while I'm enjoying my lovely trip across the lake, I'm also wondering about how much ozone I am breathing. And well, why do I care? What is so special about breathing ozone? So ambient ozone, or tropospheric ozone, is associated with numerous negative health impacts in humans. So we have this sort of animation of a lung, and we can see that with high levels of ozone, there is some constriction of the airways, and this can lead to problems like asthma attacks, coughing, wheezing. Prolonged exposure can lead to lung damage. It's associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease or respiratory and cardiovascular related death. Pretty negative impacts in humans, but humans are not the only things that can be negatively impacted by ozone. So plants exposed to high levels of ozone experience leaf browning, which can lead to decreased crop yield. So this top figure is a healthy leaf that has not been exposed to much ozone, and the bottom image is a leaf that's experienced high levels of ozone exposure, and you can see some serious leaf browning. And with this leaf browning, we also can have decreased ability to uptake CO2. So with reduced CO2 uptake by plants, this can have an impact on the CO2 radiative effect. So often we sort of think of plants as being a big sink for CO2, and if we have a bunch of unhealthy plants that are all damaged by ozone, you can reduce their ability to uptake that CO2, which has a big impact on. And finally, ozone itself is also a greenhouse gas, so it, without even affecting plants, can impact the climate. And so for all these reasons, ozone in the troposphere is bad. It is currently regulated by the US EPA as a criteria pollutant. And despite these regulations, ozone is still, in certain areas, exceeding these EPA acceptable levels. So here we have a satellite image of Lake Michigan, where there's Wisconsin to the left and Michigan to the right. You can see Chicago, Illinois down here. And each of the shapes in this figure, the blue circles, the purple diamonds, and the yellow squares, represent a ground-based monitor that is measuring ozone concentration. And these monitors are, for the most part, they are maintained and run at state or local or tribal levels, but all of the data at these monitors is reported to the EPA. And this is how the EPA determines if an area is attaining those standards for healthy ozone levels, or if they're exceeding those standards for healthy ozone levels. So all purple diamonds in the figure are monitors that are measuring surface ozone that is over 70 parts per billion, which is that EPA limit for the healthy, unhealthy sort of. So we have a bunch of purple diamonds all along the shore of Lake Michigan on both sides. And then the blue circles are monitors that are measuring ozone at acceptable levels. And so there are some blue circles along the lake shore, but most of those blue circles are away from the lake. And then the yellow squares are just non-operational monitors at the time that I downloaded this image, which was about a week ago. So the EPA will use these monitoring data to determine if an area is in attainment or not for ozone. So all of these sort of blue shaded regions are areas that the EPA designates as non-attainment. And so what's interesting is that all of these non-attainment areas are along the lake, but they're not necessarily in areas that we would think of as being huge urban centers. So sure, there's some non-attainment in Chicago, and there's several purple diamonds for monitors that are over the acceptable limit. But we also have some blue shaded areas and purple monitors up near Sheboygan and Manitowoc County, which are regions that at least I don't often think of as bustling commercial centers. And then in comparison with Madison, we have monitors that show acceptable levels of ozone. So from this distribution of the monitors, we might deduce that there's something about the lake or something about conditions around the lake that are affecting ozone concentration. And this is happening because ozone is what is called a secondary pollutant. So it is not coming directly from like your car tailpipe or a smokestack. It's being formed in the air from reactions of other gases. And these reactions and these gases can be affected by meteorological conditions. So the most important, or the biggest, most obvious meteorological condition that affects the formation of ozone and ozone concentration is sunlight. Sunlight is one of the three key ingredients for formation of tropospheric ozone. The other two ingredients are NOx, which come from the combustion of fossil fuels, and volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. So we have this sort of like idyllic little cityscape, and we can have maybe a power plant that's emitting some NOx. You might have cars or a diesel truck that is also emitting NOx in the combustion of those fossil fuels. You might have businesses or homes that are emitting VOCs, and these could be things from cooking. They could also be from things like paint solvents. When you're at the gas station and you kind of smell gasoline, that's a VOC. And then you might also get some biogenic or BVOCs coming from greases in a city. And these are things like isoprene or alpha-pinene that you might actually smell, like if you ever have that strong smell of pine resin. So those are biogenic VOCs. And all of these things will react together in the presence of sunlight to give you ozone. Ozone has a very strong diurnal cycle, so it builds up during the day, and then as soon as the sun goes down, there is no more sunlight, and ozone, all that ozone that is formed during the day will slowly start to be destroyed, and the concentration will decrease. So the next sort of meteorological factor that's really important in the formation of ozone is temperature. So here we have two figures, one from Chicago, Illinois, and one from Madison, Wisconsin, and both are plotting concentrations of ozone and temperature versus day of year. So we have in orange the number of days that had a 75 parts per billion ozone or higher concentration, and in the blue dashed line we have days with a 90-degree Fahrenheit temperature or higher. And so we see that in general, days with high temperatures, so over 90 degrees, are also the days that we have, are also the times when we have high ozone levels. So these two do tend to trend pretty well together. An increasing temperature is known to increase ozone concentration through a couple of chemical mechanisms. And this trend is well documented in many locations. There are other weather trends that are somewhat more variable or more regionally dependent. So temperature has a very strong positive relationship with ozone, meaning an increase in temperature increases ozone. Regional stagnation, so a stagnant air mass, does have a positive association with ozone. And this is because the reactants, your NOx and your VOCs, have time to get together and react to form ozone. So more stagnant air means more reactions, means more ozone. On the flip side, you have wind speed has a negative correlation with ozone. So increasing wind speed means that those reactants can't get together to make ozone, so you have sort of that negative relationship. The problem with wind speed is that it can also transport ozone. So if you live downwind of an area that is producing a lot of NOx and VOCs, you might have high ozone days when the wind is blowing from that area. So this negative relationship does depend on location. Mixing depth has a weak or variable relationship with ozone. And so mixing depth is sort of what's the volume that those reactants can react in, and then also what's the volume for ozone to be dispersed in. And the relationship is weak or variable because there are multiple competing pathways for reactions to be affected by mixing depth. Same with humidity. So humidity can increase ozone concentration by affecting some of our VOC reactions. It can decrease ozone by affecting some of our NOx reactions. So that also can have a very weak or variable relationship with ozone depending on location and concentrations of NOx and VOCs. Cloud cover has a negative relationship with ozone, and this makes sense. High cloud cover, you don't have a lot of sunlight, and so you're not going to have those NOx VOC reactions happening to make ozone. And then precipitation also has a weaker variable relationship, and this is similar to humidity, but precipitation also can result in wet deposition of ozone, but this is not it's not a strong factor in fact affecting ozone because ozone doesn't uptake into water very readily. And like I said, these relationships do depend on location. So here we have a map of the eastern and middle of the United States from Camalier et al. And so they looked at the relationship between ozone and a few meteorological factors at 43 distinct locations across the United States. So each of these points in the figure is one of their study locations. And so they were basically correlating ozone with 3 different meteorological variables. So they were looking at temperature, transport, and humidity. And so we can see in the north that temperature is pretty dominant. Wind or transport direction is also important. And then as we sort of move further south, temperature becomes less important and humidity becomes more important. And finally, you get down here into like Florida or the southeast of the US, and humidity and transport dominate. These regional patterns do tell us a lot about what could be happening with ozone, but there's a lot of sort of empty space between each of these locations, right? And there's not a whole lot of like what's happening up in northern Maine or what's actually happening over most of Wisconsin. So there is some missing area as well. And so the initial motivation for this study was we wanted to recreate this figure, but on a finer scale so that we could see some of the details that might have been missed by looking at only these 43 distinct locations. So this is sort of the final product of a lot of statistical analysis, and I will explain how it was made in a moment. But first, what I really want to point out is that when you use a fine resolution model, you have a lot of spatial variability. So over the entire United States, temperature does dominate. And I am realizing that this might not be the most appropriate color scale for today. But for right now, temperature is red. And so we have temperature dominates. Like Camalier, it's pretty important over the northern part of the United States, but we see a lot of interesting details happening around areas like Texas, for example, or in the Pacific Northwest. So what we wanted to do was sort of zoom in on a region and really see what was going on a very fine scale, because we might be missing some important details when looking at sort of this huge picture and using statistics that cover the entire population of the data set over the United States, as opposed to looking at what might be happening in a small location. And so this being Wisconsin, we wanted to look at what was happening over Lake Michigan. And there is a good amount of literature out there explaining what is happening in terms of ozone and meteorology around the lake. So we could sort of validate our findings by comparing with what we know from the literature. So motivating questions. How does meteorology affect ozone concentration around Lake Michigan? What is the spatial distribution of dominant meteorological predictors? And how do different meteorological variables interact to influence ozone concentration? So this third motivating question is referring to the combinations like we saw with Kamali et al. So how does temperature compare to temperature and transport direction? And so in order to answer these questions, I wanted to use I wanted to perform some statistical analysis. So first, we had to generate our data. So the data generation step is all thanks to Monica Harkey, as I had mentioned. And then we had to do some processing so that the model data and the observational data that we also used were looking at the same phenomena. And then we categorize the meteorological variables so that things like temperature at the surface and 2-meter temperature were not repeated, or were not describing the same phenomena, and we were deriving sort of extra statistical significance from looking at both of them at the same time. And then we used a generalized linear model to analyze the data and sort of assess how much of the variability in ozone concentration was being explained by one or more meteorological variables. And then we tested for significance, and then if something was statistically significant, we would repeat our GLM analysis by adding additional meteorological variables until we could understand how these variables combined to influence ozone over the lake. So what is a generalized linear model? That is probably, so a generalized linear model is distinct from a general linear model. A general linear model is basically just linear regression. You have some independent variable, predictor X, and it will have some correlation coefficient that will help you to predict your dependent variable Y. And that predicted Y will be different in some way from the true value of Y, and that'll be what you could call a residual. It's also the error or the random component in Y. And the generalized linear model will build off of this linear regression approach, but instead of having just a random and systematic component, so not just your Y and your X, you also have what's called a link function, and that's encompassed in this G here. G is basically explaining how your systematic X components are related to the random error component. So if we had a link function, an identity link function, that means that we're assuming our random error component is normally distributed, and so we would basically be reverting back to a linear regression model. If instead we think that we have a binomial distribution, for example, we would use a link function to be able to use our linear sort of systematic component and relate that to our binomial distribution of the random component with the link. And for our analysis of ozone, we used a log link function. This is pretty consistent with the literature, and it produced good correlation strength with our data. So our data we used 2 ozone data sets. So we have these, the model data was from the community multi-square quality model. And this was run initially over the entire United States on a 12-kilometer by 12-kilometer grid scale. But then when we zoomed in on on our study area over Lake Michigan, we maintained that grid scale. So although it's a little worse for our small area, it's consistent with what we were using for our entire US domain. And then we compared this model data with ground-based data from the EPA air quality system AQS monitors. And these are the same monitors that I had presented in the second slide of that satellite image about where monitoring data is showing high levels of ozone around Lake Michigan. So these two data sets were able to validate our CMAQ using the AQS data and compare the GLM results between the two. And one of the first things that we'll notice between our CMAQ and AQS data is that CMAQ has some very high ozone over the lake, whereas AQS, there are no monitors over the lake. The closest you can get is along the shoreline. And AQS in general does have lower values of ozone than CMAQ. This is well reported and documented in the literature, and there are a couple of proposed reasons why this might be. But basically, our AQS data is showing that we have lower concentrations in general compared to CMAQ. And then for our meteorological data, we use the Weather Research and Forecasting, or WRF model, to get 18 different meteorological variables. And all of this data was for June 1st to August 31st, 2011 summer season. We wanted to focus on summer because that is when ozone is the highest because of increased sunlight and increased temperature. So now that we have our data, we can sort of categorize our meteorological variables and figure out which ones are important for understanding ozone. And you'll see that in our categories, so for temperature, for example, we have some variables that are providing repetitive information. So temperature at 2 meters, temperature at the ground, and outgoing long wave radiation are all somewhat related. So in order to determine which variables were actually providing new additional information, we ran the GLM for each variable and then compared using the adjusted R-squared. So if a variable did not provide additional information, we did not continue using it moving forward. So of our original 18 variables, we did not use 6 of them. So this is, for the most part, these results make sense. What I thought was interesting was that cloud fraction was not included. So cloud fraction apparently did not provide additional information in our GLM, and this might be that cloud fraction is not exactly a continuous variable in the WRF data set, so it's more of like a count because representing a fraction of the sky. So our log link might not have been adequately representing the relationship between cloud fraction and ozone because of the sort of count nature of cloud fraction. The other interesting point is that relative humidity was not as important as specific humidity. I was somewhat surprised by this because relative humidity does sort of incorporate additional variables such as temperature and pressure, so I thought it would have been able to describe the relationship with ozone a little bit better than specific humidity, but it turns out I was wrong. So now that we've categorized our variables, we can analyze the statistical significance of each data point. So at every single point in this domain, which was 8,000 data points, we tested for individual significance at an alpha of 0.01. And then we also wanted to test for field significance. So I should say a huge thank you to Elizabeth Maroon for teaching about field significance in her 575 class, and also providing an example of code to use. So that was extremely helpful. Thank you so much. So field significance testing is a way to determine if over a large area you have, just by chance, data points that show individual significance but really aren't actually significant. And you want to do this when you have a large area because even when you test for individual significance, there's still that chance there's still that percent, which here would be 1% for our individual significance testing, that the relationship we're seeing is actually just by chance, that it seems significant, but it's really not. And when you do that over many data points, so here over 8,000 data points, that 1% chance means that there are a decent number of grid points that could be giving you false positives. So we tested for field significance using the false discovery rate as outlined in Wilkes 2016 at an alpha of 0.02. And I know that alpha seems a little odd, like a 98% confidence interval. And so that's the recommendation from Wilkes, where it's the field significance alpha should be double your individual significance level. And then finally, we sort of set a limit for our coefficient of determination, or R-squared value, of 0.2. So any meteorological variables that showed an R-squared of 0.2 or less with ozone we said that did not explain variability in ozone at that grid point. So in this figure, I believe of temperature correlated with ozone, all of these white spaces are data points that either did not pass individual statistical significance, field significance, or our 0.2 R-squared cutoff. And so we repeated this for all of our categories. So we have temperature, specific humidity, mixing, which encompassed planetary boundary layer height, convective velocity scale, and friction velocity. Insolation, which was our incoming shortwave radiation and cloud liquid water content, and the cloud top height minus cloud bottom height. And then wind, which was direction and speed. So when we compare our CMAQ results with our AQS results, there are some similarities and there are also some definite differences. And one of the first things that I want to point out is that it's difficult to really compare what's happening over the lake and up in the northern section of our study area, because AQS didn't have many monitors up in the northern region and it had no monitors over the lake. So while we can say it's interesting that temperature in CMAQ shows correlation over the lake, but specific humidity doesn't, we really can't validate that against the AQS data because we don't have data in that area. So some similarities, we see that temperature is a predictor at quite a few data points, and insolation is also an important predictor. Insolation, interestingly though, seems to be more important along the western edge of the lake in the AQS data, which is not really seen in our CMAQ data. So in the CMAQ data set, it looks like insolation is more important over the lake and up in the north, both of which are areas without a whole lot of AQS data to validate against. For wind, we do see some similar regions, like along the western shore near Milwaukee. But again, wind is showing significance in areas where we don't have a whole lot of AQS data. But it is interesting that wind seems to be more important, again, near the southern or western edge of the lake, and we don't see that in AQS. And mixing, similarly, we sort of see something happening along the eastern edge in CMAQ, maybe a little significance, but mostly we see our significance along the western edge in the AQS data set. And then specific humidity is the category that seems to be the most divergent, where we see huge importance of specific humidity along the eastern edge of the lake in the CMAQ data, but we don't really see any of that in the AQS data, and we only see a few points that seem to have statistical significance in our AQS data. So I was somewhat surprised by the level of statistical significance that specific humidity showed in the CMAQ data, just because the literature indicates that specific humidity is really not a strong predictor of ozone in general. So I sort of expected more of the results that we see with our AQS data. And so now that we've sort of categorized and analyzed the categories, we can combine categories to see how they influence the ozone over the lake in combination with each other. So here we have combinations of our categories. And first thing I want to point out is that now we have different R-squared scales. So in general, the AQS data had lower correlation strength. So the scale only goes from 0.2 to 0.5, which is different from the scale that we have for our CMATA. So one of the first things that is quite apparent in comparison to the category maps is that AQS, the correlation strength of the AQS data, there's many more sites that seem to indicate some sort of relationship with between the meteorological variables and ozone. So there's a lot more data points that are showing up on these figures for AQS. So with the AQS data, we have temperature and insolation, wind and mixing, wind and insolation, and mixing and insolation as important combinations of categories. So insolation seems to be one of the big predictors for ozone around the Lake Michigan study area for AQS. But we do see that wind and mixing, both of which describe how the ozone precursors can react with each other, we see that mixing and wind are both pretty important. In comparison, for CMAQ, we have wind and specific humidity, temperature and wind, mixing and specific humidity, temperature and specific humidity, and temperature and mixing. So temperature is definitely the dominant predictor for CMAQ data set, but we do see that mixing and wind are still very important. And it is surprising that with the CMAQ data, the insolation category doesn't really seem to be as important in combination with other variables. So again, I was surprised that specific humidity seemed to keep coming up with the CMAQ data. And again, the specific humidity seems to be most important along that eastern edge of Lake Michigan in all three of the combinations that it was statistically significant with. Temperature seems to have a pretty wide distribution of influence, affecting both sides of the lake as well as over the lake itself. And finally, once we've sort of looked at these combinations, we can determine which category or combination of categories is most important over or at each grid point over the lake and determine what's the major predictor in that location. So here we have maps showing at each grid point what is the most influential combination of categories or simple category affecting ozone. So there's some similarities and differences again between our model and our ground-based observational data. One of the first things you'll notice is that the temperature is very important in both. So there's a lot of red and a lot of tan, which is temperature and wind, in our CMAQ map. And then we have a lot of red and orange, so temperature and mixing and temperature and insolation in our AQS map. And so we definitely can see that temperature is a very strong predictor of ozone over this study area. But we also can see things like wind and mixing are still important. So mixing is involved in 3 of the 4 categories that are important for the AQS data. So it's temperature, insolation, and wind. And wind is important in 4 of the 6 categories related to CMAQ, and mixing in 2 of the 6 categories. So the distribution of mixing and wind is a little variable between the 2 plots, but it is interesting that both capture the importance of mixing, so PBL height, frictive velocity, and convective velocity scale, and wind, which is wind direction and wind speed. And so even though these plots do have some differences between them, they are sort of in general describing how temperature and wind and mixing affect what's happening to ozone around Lake Michigan. And this is pretty consistent with what we know about the literature, from the literature about ozone around the lake. So here we have a figure from Foley et al. 2011. So this was part of a aircraft-based mission to study ozone over the lake And it was a 9-year aircraft study, and they specifically flew out over the lake during high non-attainment or ozone exceedance days. And so what they found was that during the afternoon, you would end up having high levels of ozone over the lake. And these high levels of ozone over the lake would get blown over to the land because by the afternoon, the land is warmer than the lake. And so you have that onshore breeze, which is sort of influencing ozone concentration over the land. So here, the important variables for ozone on land are the mixing or inversion, PBL height, wind direction and wind speed, and temperature. And those are sort of the 3 big categories that we came up with, although in somewhat of different spatial distributions along the lake in our maps. So our results, although somewhat divergent in the 2 figures, are consistent with what we know from the literature. And this is sort of good to know when moving forward and sort of looking at further regions across the United States. So getting back to this original figure of our distributions of meteorological variables over the entire United States, there's a lot to break down here and really understand what's happening. So one thing you might notice is that in this figure, it looks like temperature is very important, but then we have this small region along the lake where relative humidity and wind are important. But in our zoomed in section, we didn't really find that relative humidity was important at all. And so that's just showing all of the statistics of the entire population, the entire US domain are affecting what we can see on a finer scale. So it is important to zoom in and see what's going on at a local or regional level. So in the next steps, I'll be looking at sort of smaller local regions to see what's going on in those areas. And I think that is all that I have. So thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Alicia. I like all the claps.
Because we can't be in person, so all of the clapping is very nice.
I know, it's awesome. So I wanted to let the clap emojis emerge, but also open up for questions. I don't know how they usually do questions on this, but it seems like the hand raise function or just turning on your camera might be a good idea. And maybe Alicia, you could turn off your slide so we can see the faces of folks if they ask questions.
Yeah, sure. We'll stop sharing. If there are no questions, that would also be great.
No.
I do not mind.
No. Elizabeth, thanks for the question.
Sure, I can always come up with a question. Thanks for the nice talk. That was very clear, and I don't work on this stuff at all. And I learned something new. Generalized linear models are new to me. I'll read up on those some more later. So my question is, when you put together the generalized linear model, why did you only use combinations of 2 predictors? Why not 3? Or is that getting to the point of overfitting or something like that?
Yeah, so I was worried about overfitting, and that was also why we cut out so many of the variables in the beginning, because we really wanted to avoid overfitting the data. Yes.
All right, cool.
Alicia, I have a question, which is maybe you could sort of speculate about who could use this information. Like, it's cool from a scientific perspective, you know, with the comment that, you know, ozone is regulated and impacts public health and plants. Like, what does the sensitivity to weather variables, you know, how does that help?
Yeah, I totally should have prepared for this question, knowing Tracy. So I think it is important to know from a regulatory standpoint. So the EPA the way they regulate ozone and they set their limits is they actually do understand that ozone can be influenced by meteorology. So you don't actually just have a set, your 70 ppb limit is your set limit, but the EPA doesn't say, oh, you've crossed that threshold, you're now in non-attainment. They know that there are going to be days when you have non-attainment because of meteorology. So, knowing what meteorological conditions affect ozone can help the EPA sort of regulate, are you in attainment, are you not? And that can help local and state governments know how much effort and money and time they need to put into getting attainment. It also can help for a region like Sheboygan know that a lot of their pollution is probably coming from Chicago. So it's their plan to reach attainment is not really going to be dependent on local emission sources.
Thanks. There's two questions that have come up in the chat. One says, does the humidity wind combination sensitive to the dominant wind direction over the lake?
Yeah, so the wind category included wind direction and wind speed. And wind direction was the more dominant of the two variables in that category. So most of the correlation strength with wind was actually due to wind direction.
And the next question is, did you figure out why the local area specific humidity matters, but relative humidity doesn't?
No, that's a really interesting question. And I think that's one of those things that I want to look at next. So I would have thought in general that relative humidity is more important because it does sort of encompass a little bit more information. But I don't know. And that definitely something I want to look into.
Great. And our next question is from Patty Cleary, who is giving a seminar on a very similar topic next week. So it's exciting to have you here. Go ahead, Patty. You're muted. I think you're muted.
There we go. I muted doubly. There we go. So I love the talk. It's great. And my question is, like, first of all, how does CMAQ treat the surface of the lake? Like, what is the thermodynamic properties of the lake? Because my guess is that the specific humidity versus relative might relate to the difference between kind of lake air and ground air if it's not treating that surface thermodynamically correctly, but I don't know. And also, and kind of on a side, your insolation trends do you think that it has to do with just synoptic trends, like high pressure?
Oh, that's interesting. So for the first question, I'm not sure. So I'm still learning CMAQ and how it relates to these different variables, or how it relates meteorological conditions to our chemistry that's happening. I do know that CMAQ does not do a great job at dealing with things like dry deposition over water. And I don't know if that is potentially affecting ozone concentration. It wouldn't be affecting things like specific versus relative humidity, but that could be a factor about ozone over the lake. In terms of the insolation, if it's sort of representing, do you mind repeating your question? Actually, I think I lost my train of thought.
When I see insolation correlating to high ozone over Lake Michigan, I always imagine that's that high pressure system, that synoptic high pressure system that's sort of clearing out all the clouds.
Okay,
so
I see.
You think it's capturing, like that's an artifact of it capturing a high pressure or modeling a high pressure system.
So it could be. What I found was that pressure did actually not show statistical significance with ozone. So it might be that a lot of sunlight over the lake is in some way influenced, is in some way actually representing a high pressure system where you have really nice, clear, sunny skies. But pressure itself did not correlate very well, and that to me indicates that it might not be the pressure system, but the actual sunlight, at least to a certain extent.
Well, we look forward to your seminar next week, Patty. Thanks for joining today. And are there any other questions? Gerald.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, Alicia. So when you were looking at the AQS data and then you were correlating them to the meteorological variables, was the met data from the model, or was it surface observation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the answer is also the WRF data. So that probably does explain some of the lower correlation strength that we see between meteorological variables and ozone in the AQS data set, because we were using the WRF data, which is on that 12 by 12 kilometer grid that the CMAQ data is on. And so the WRF variables had to be resampled to be on the AQS data grid, which might explain why. So the AQS data points may not fit really nicely inside that, where that WRF variable is, and so that might explain some of that lower correlation strength where the meteorological variable is kind of offset from where the AQS is measuring ozone.
I see, thanks.
Great. Well, any last questions for Alicia? Well, with that, we'll thank our speaker, and thank you, Alicia, for joining us.
Thank you all for listening.
And it was really nice to be part of this seminar series. Thank you. Bye.